Hello to the grade 11 students at St. Andrews Regional High School. I have some of your questions here that I didn't get a chance to answer in our very lively conversation. So I wanted to take the time, now that I have it, in order to go through these one by one and give you just a continuance of our lovely conversation. So again, if it's been a few weeks, but this is Rabbi Matthew Ponak. I live in Esquimalt. I'm a local. And we had a lovely conversation very recently in which you wrote down some questions about Judaism or these kinds of topics generally. So here we go. First one on my list. You mentioned heaven and hell in my talk. I think I mentioned it at some point, and that you don't often, meaning I think Jewish people don't often talk about the afterlife, or Jewish sources talk about it less, and that your traditions see them differently. Could you elaborate on that? What do you believe happens after death? So to speak from let's say, from the sources, Jewishly, we have teachings on what happens to us after we die, but not all of our teachings agree with each other. If you look at the broad perspective from all of the texts, let's say, that all the ones that I'm aware of in Jewish history, some of the ones behind me here, right, or any of those throughout the ages, you get different versions of what an afterlife looks like. And they range, really, there are versions of reincarnation. There are versions of something akin to heaven and hell, maybe sometimes you can find a really strong emphasis on that sort of hell existence, but most of it is more something like a temporary, like a purgatory, a transition process, getting into there's just so many different versions of it. And the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible, right, doesn't say a whole lot. If you look, there's not that many sources you can draw out from there that are literal. So the basic teaching from Judaism, based on all these different perspectives, is that at the end of the day, our tradition emphasizes this life. Yes, we have understandings or opinions about what happens after this life, but none of us really know. So let's make the most of this life, right? So a lot of Judaism really focuses on that. So do I believe? I would say that I don't have a clear one answer. I imagine, or I hope that I'll come back again. I'm sort of a reincarnation person personally. That's a very Jewish mystical perspective, you could say, in Kabbalah, the sort of area that I spend my most amount of my time in studying and teaching. There's a lot of reincarnation teachings. But I also have spent time meditating on versions of the afterlife that I find uncomfortable, because I think it's good to spend some time facing fears, if you know what I'm saying. So if people feel up for that, I think it can be a very fruitful endeavor. What's your hope? And what are the things that you fear? And can we spend time just bringing to mind the things that may be a bit more uncomfortable within reason, not the things that maybe really, really might scare us, but can we find an acceptance of what may come? So that's how I try to live my life and be open to the process. And there are things that I know tangibly. I know I have a family. I know I have work to do. I know I have a body. And these are the things that I spend more of my energy on than imagining what might be, but something that I can't prove. All right, so the next question. Why in Orthodox Judaism is it the mother, if the mother is Jewish, then the children are Jewish, but for Reform, it can be either parents? I don't know if there's a single easy answer I could give on this, but there's some degree of tradition involved. I don't think there's a very clear answer that I'm aware of historically of why it was decided that it was the mother. There are different versions people talk about, but I've never found them very convincing. So I know that there are also sources from major rabbis in history, like major scholars, who say that actually you need both parents, right? Someone can convert, of course, but you have to have both to be Jewish. So in this era, it seems like and it's not just Orthodox, like in Canada, essentially Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, primarily it's a Jewish mother, right? That's sort of the decision collectively that's been made. But in the US, Reform recognizes what's called patrilineal descent as long as the child is active. So does the Reconstructionist movement, the renewal movement, I believe, to some degree also. But let's just say lines are drawn. I wish I could explain why one line is drawn and another isn't. I think there's a sense of the importance of continuity in general, but I can't explain the sources of the argumentation. Perhaps from the reform perspective in America, they're trying to make it just a bit more open and not exclusive. And there's a more conservative, let's say, small c conservative cultural element that wants to keep it the same as it's always been through the mother. But the funny thing is, it hasn't always been just through the mother. There's people who argue major like sources of Jewish law and history that argue that you have to have both. So I'm going to call that one complicated, but that's part of our discussion, right? In our tradition, where we discuss it, and sometimes we do our best with what we have. So it's an ebb and a flow historically about the real kind of lines of who's in and who's out. And myself, I'm a pretty big 10th person, so I'm open to people who are sincerely wanting to be involved, even if they don't meet all of the, let's say, genetic lineage criteria necessarily of certain ancestors. Okay, that's not the most important thing for me personally. What do you value most in your faith? If I had to name it, I really love that in the Jewish culture and tradition, we have this combination of really seeking meaning in life. Like we really, really value, this is not we don't have a secular view, so to speak, of the world. Like I certainly don't. I think by and large, the vast majority of the Jews in history, certainly the ones writing the book, would say there's a meaning in this world. Like there's something very deeply, we're being guided on some level. It might not always be obvious, right? But we pair that meaning with an openness and a discussion and a dialogue. It's not just life is beautiful and life is meaningful in this one way, and you must follow this way to be a good Jew. It's not like that. There's a basic acknowledgement of there's meaning here, but we don't suppose that we always know what it is. So I think there's an intellectual humility and striving to make our lives better, essentially, tapping into that meaning, but not having the, I'll say, arrogance to suppose that we have all the answers already. I think it's a really lovely combination. And that's one of the things. There's so many things I could say, but that's one of them that comes to mind. Why did Jewish people sacrifice lambs? Well, at some point, everyone had a sacrificial culture back in the ancient Near East. So one of the explanations that one of my favorite rabbis from history, I don't know if he's actually one of my favorites. He's one of the great rabbis. Let's say he and I have different perspectives on a lot of things. So he's not, I respect the great medieval rabbi Maimonides and his intellect and his capacities as a scholar. So he says essentially the reason why God gave the Israelites all these commandments about sacrificing was because that's what everyone else was doing at the time. And if God had told, or God, he, she, it, whatever, the divine had told uh, the Israelites to pray out of prayer books or something like that, or do something other, or meditate or whatever, like it wouldn't have had an ability to meet them. It wouldn't have been accessible. So according to Maimonides, the goal was always to bring the Israelites gradually into a place of prayer and into a place maybe even of meditation in the future. Some say that's hinted at in Maimonides' writings. But in essence, everyone was doing that. That was sort of the nature of religious expression at the time. So that's one answer. Specifically, lambs, it seems that that might have been an important symbol vis-a-vis the Egyptians at the time in ancient Egypt. There was something, might have been a lamb god, some people say, and it was like extra potent to have the Israelites sacrificing lambs to protect themselves from that 10th plague. These are sort of, let's say, opinions, and some are stronger than others, but the essence of it is this is the way that religion functioned at the time. And some people even sacrificed children in that era. So we definitely weren't doing that according to Torah law, but this was part of the culture because at a certain time at a certain place, this is what some people do, right? And exists today in our world. Like there are people who sacrifice animals in different parts of the world today. So that's how we began, and we changed over time. Do you align with Jewish practices or ways? Sometimes. I'm, as I said in our discussion, I'm independent. I would say there is amongst certain Orthodox devotees a real deep love of God and a very deep passion for that and the service of God and the connection and like the life of spirituality. I would say in many ways that's the part I resonate with most. I feel that. I feel like life in essence is a spiritual journey. And that kind of attitude and orientation and that you could say passion or fervor even, I find that less common in other denominations. It's around, but it's less common, I would say. And not everyone in the Orthodox world has that. Just to say that is the way in which I resonate the most and the sort of intentionality of life. I do not feel beholden to the, certain codes of Jewish law in the way that Orthodox practitioners do, but I learn from them. There's a lot of wisdom in those texts, even if I don't feel like I am required by some kind of karmic force to be keeping every single detail. So that's some of how I contend with it today. There are similarities, there are differences. At the end of the day, I think we can learn from everyone. I think we should learn from everyone. So I've learned a lot from my time journeying through Orthodox Judaism and as well as all the denominations in different ways. Are there any differences in values that that I am sharing with values that other denominations of Judaism have? So you say that disagreement is found in the Talmud. Is that accepted in Orthodox teaching? So people have different views, but values, I would say the kinds of values that I bring forward when I visit your class are pretty well adopted and held and inherited and passed on by all the denominations, more or less. And you can find elements in all kinds of spaces in different denominations that don't always love disagreement on core issues, for sure. But I would say just because one group today doesn't engage in that kind of dialogue or debating, it doesn't mean that it's not a core Jewish value. It just means that they might not be expressing it at this moment. So mostly the core values are similar, but you would find some elements that are different as well. If we were together right now, we could kind of talk maybe more about some specifics, but there's definitely a love of dialogue and debate. It might not be always on the same topics. There might be things that are considered almost sacred to a degree that people don't want to talk about them, right? Like you can find denominations where political perspectives, we don't talk about those because those are too, it's going to be not just maybe sacred's the wrong word, but like that's going to be too difficult. Or there, you might find religious settings where religion, like the core value of are we going to do this ritual or not, is too sacred to even discuss in a sense, right? There's not, it would be too intense. So there are, just like anywhere you go, there's some topics, that are a little bit more touchy. I would hope that we could talk about all of them, but in reality, not everyone's always up for that, right? But the general idea of debate and dialogue is alive all over in all the denominations. And yeah, the perspective of let's be loving and let's be kind and let's grow and all of that and have a good life. Those are pretty core. And you'll find those everywhere, right? But sometimes the details and how those play out in different scenarios, they can differ. I do not purport to speak on behalf of all Jews. I can't. I can't speak on behalf of all denominations. I can share my perspective, and there's people out there who differ from me, right? That's how it's always going to be. So that's what I'll say on that. How do you feel about the statements of Kanye West? I mean, I wish if we were in person, I'd say wish statements because he said a lot. And in essence, my basic take on Kanye West is he seems like obviously someone who started off as just a very talented rapper and a creative person. And he went a little off the rails, maybe a lot off the rails. And I was, I've seen a few quotes here and there, like kind of relooking at it. This already is sort of like an older story at this point. And he, at some point, came out and apologized and said he had some kind of brain injury that was causing him to act erratically. I don't know. That sounds like maybe it would be fitting, but let's just say anyone who's spreading that kind of hate is not my kind of human, right? Or when they're in a state of mind where they're doing that, they're not someone I would ever support in that state of mind. He clearly has some wounding and he decided to take it out on my group of people. He's spread falsehoods, he's slandered. Like that's just anytime we're demonizing another group, like we're not doing the right thing. It's one thing to have an issue with an individual or even like an issue with a collective body of power brokers or governments or whatever. But the words that I've seen him say are not that. He is spreading falsehood. He is demonizing, or he was at least. So it's not it's not my cup of tea to say the least. So that's what I'd say. And one other thing, I just caught a particular stream. He was tapping into a style of, let's call it religious philosophy or theology through the Black Hebrew Israelites, which is a collective of people who their understanding, I don't know if I'd call it understanding. The message that they put out into the world is that people like me aren't really Jews and that Black Americans, or some of them, are the real Jews from the lost tribes. You know, we know our history pretty well. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. I can trace my line back a really long way. I can trace my genetics all the way to the Levant, to ancient Israel. Like, I know who I am. It's one thing if you want to say that you are also included in the group and like I'd be open to a conversation, but to tell Jews that they're not really Jews is just, it's slander and it's hateful and it's hurtful. So in those ways too, they're like, we know who we are, right? And people want to co-opt that or claim that they're the real ones. Like, okay, we've seen this before in history. It's not a kind move. It's not a good move. It's not an honest move. So I would encourage people, there might be lines of ancient Israelites that found their way into Africa. And then maybe some of them ended up in America. I'm open to that. But let's try to be intellectually honest. And I just don't find that movement particularly intellectually honest. I think I'm being gentle when I say this also. Like it's not based on truth or provable truth. So I would be very, very careful about some of these accusations. So that's a little on Kanye West. Again, if you're in person, we could kind of dialogue a bit more, but that's kind of that's my take. As a rabbi, do you believe that it's your responsibility to give your insight on ethical and political opinions to people in your congregation? So I don't have a congregation. Firstly, I have a private practice. I do a lot of one-on-one sessions. I do online courses, some in-person courses. I go visit different communities, and I have a freelance rabbi practice. So I can't answer this as a congregational rabbi, but my general approach to these kinds of topics, ideally, I like to empower people to find their own views. If someone's really off the mark ethically or politically, yes, I will give my 2 cents or more on that. But generally speaking, my primary orientation to this is about connecting to spirituality and allowing that to inform our ethical lives and our politics, if you will. But the politics is really an aside. I think to have a community and not ever go into politics is not sustainable. It's going to have to come up, but I don't see that as the main focus. For me, Sabbath, right? Shabbat, those kinds of moments when we gather, it should mostly be about tapping into all the goodness and all the sweetness in our world and less about talking about all the problems. Like there's problems in our world. That's how it is, right? And so someone's particular political view on this issue or that issue, I tend not to go there very much in a professional context. There are some rabbis who that's their thing. Great. They're like political activist kind of rabbis in different regards. So I would say I want to create a context in which people can be wise and people can be good. And I believe a lot of that comes through spiritual connection and opportunities for dialogue and all of that. But I spend more time wanting to facilitate that than giving my opinions on various issues. Yeah. Lastly, would Catholics still have to change to Judaism or vice versa to marry each other? So that's a good question. I suppose it matters like who are you asking? I mean, you're asking me, but I don't have a legal capacity to limit people to marry, right? There are some countries, right? Today in the world where interfaith marriage is not allowed, right? I don't think that's what you mean. I think what you're meaning is if you're Catholic and you fall in love with someone who's Jewish, can you get married? And I will say, just on the practical basis, you could always find someone in BC here to marry you. Like it's illegal and it's legal. There's nothing stopping you. Culturally, I want to call that a question depending on the families or the individuals. It's at very least there's some complexity there. But interfaith marriage, we would call it, it's not a new phenomenon. It's a controversial phenomenon to some degree, because partly if you're going to have kids, let's say, it can be confusing and difficult to have multiple different holidays in the home, right? And you might think as a Catholic that it's not such a big deal. And maybe you're going to marry someone who's Jewish who doesn't think it's such a big deal either. But when kids are around, there's often things that come up in the parents that they didn't really think they cared about that much. And it feels more fierce and stronger. So I'll say that an interfaith marriage or interfaith, let's say, relationship with children or whatever, it has some challenges. I am not the religion police, right? I don't live my life in that way. I also am not someone who at this point in my career even officiates weddings, but the key ingredient I would think everyone needs to have are values, right? If you share values with someone, look, all things being equal, it is easier if you could just wave a magic wand and marry the perfect person. If they're of your tradition and faith and your culture, that it's easier. It's just easier. The family dynamics are usually easier overall. Like if everything else equal, if they're part of your lineage, it's easier. But today, there are all kinds of officiants in the Jewish world. Certainly, I know who would do an interfaith wedding. And I think the real question is not can you? The real question is what does it mean to find a life partner? Because in my experience, it's not just about falling in love. It's certainly not just about feeling physically attracted to someone. It's actually about, does this relationship make sense also? Like we need multiple factors there to kind of increase the likelihood that it'll work, because it can be a challenge, right? Marrying, having kids, all of that. This Canadian life, this Western life is not always the easiest dance that we could do. So I would say the question from my perspective about can you or can't you? Yeah, you can. The question is this the right fit? And that is the orientation I would encourage people to take. If they realize that marriage is more than just love, it's also a life path together and it involves families. It does. And when that's all in the mix, is a separation of religious traditions going to make that easier? People can convert. That happens all the time, right? Again, without knowing your specific circumstances, that would essentially be my answer. So I've made it to the end of my pile. Thank you for listening. And it's always a pleasure to come. If, I'll be back next year a couple times. And if I see you in the hall, say hello. Yeah, thank you very much for Mr. Van Dyke for hosting me. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your semester and a wonderful summer as well. Take care.